Welcome to the second video on practical criticism by Neil McCaw. This is the analysis of the second part of the essay by McCaw. McCaw moves on to the other forms of close reading. He discusses stylistics and he calls it a very much scientific and objective study of text which examines the similarity between ordinary language and that which is used in literary text to show that there is no meaningful difference between the two, and literary was not special. So that was the general way in which stylistics looked at text. But what happened with stylistics was that the people who were involved in it, they used jargons and specialized terms to explain their position. For example, you can call Roman Jakobson a stylistic to a certain extent. And they also believed that text had only one truth to convey. Still, many of their interpretations were beyond scientific analysis, and more often they moved into the realms of speculation, and sometimes they were also subjective too, according to McCaw. Then he talks about Russian formalism, and on the slide you would find one of the greatest formalists of all the time, Roman Jakobson. Russian formalism enjoyed a relationship with structuralism and stylistics, and it emerged in Russia in the early 20th century. Russian formalists believed that texts were to be judged by themselves. They believed that literature was different from any other aspect of human culture. Post-production, a poem existed independently. And McCaw says even when they claim that they didn't engage in contextualizing, the Russian formalist approach had political implications. For example, there was this idea that there was a difference between art and non-art. This was a reaction against the then Russian view that art needs to have political and social context and implications. So in such a way, even when Russian formalists were actually talking about looking at the text independently and decontextualizing it, they were actually framing that particular theory on the basis of the context in which the formalist idea itself evolved. Now, Russian formalists like Roman Jakobson recognized poetic quality or poetic language as having an identity and character of its own. Ostranenie, or defamiliarization, which was actually propagated by formalists, shows old things in a new light and thus distinguishes poetry from ordinary language. Now, according to McCaw, this particular act of estrangement, the act of defamiliarization, was actually based on the contradiction between the poetic and the non-poetic. You are actually defamiliarizing a very much familiar subject in a poem. That was the argument which was put forward by formalists. But McCaw says, in this particular contradiction between context and non-context, and this particular contradiction between poetic and non-poetic was made possible only when it is inside a text with the surrounding frame of reference. That is, what is poetic language can be understood only by referring to what was non-poetic, which forms the context of the poem. So even when Russian formalists were talking about decontextualizing, McCaw says all that they were trying to say as to give a context for a particular argument, or as to look into the text itself, is actually something which is possible only when you look at the context around, or what was referred to as non-poetic. To deconstruction and tries to compare it with close reading. For McCaw, deconstruction was fundamentally concerned with generation of meanings inside languages. And there was this overarching emphasis on text itself, as the famous quote of Derrida goes, which was misinterpreted in different ways. There is nothing outside the text. Now, though this didn't mean that there is nothing outside words, for McCaw, it can be interpreted as words were of primary significance. The slip, aporia, and all that came along with deconstructive practices demanded the deconstruction of the language on the page. So this shows that in spite of the basic difference between close reading and theoretical approaches like feminism or post-colonialism and all that came from 1960s onwards, some of these philosophical critical methods used almost the same methods as close reading did. Now, the difference between close reading and deconstruction was that while close reading looked for structures and patterns and coherent relationships between different elements of the text, deconstructionists look for imbalances, oddities, incongruences, those moments where the text contradicted itself and there were tensions between form and content. Deconstruction celebrated the gaps between words and meaning. Now, moves into the assumptions which are put forward by close reading or certain assumptions of close reading criticism. Number one, criticism for close reading was about the text itself. Second, reading is uncovering the meaning of the text, and context was actually irrelevant, and we need not look into any life lessons behind a particular text. Now, third, context was irrelevant to the purpose at hand, and meaning is found within the text and not outside the text. Now, these contexts were sometimes acknowledged as having some kind of an importance, but they were overlooked in the very process of reading a particular text. Yet, for some critics who practiced close reading, textual interpretation was connected with values and morality, especially those texts which also experimented with a form which tried to preach some kind of a moral code. And those texts for critics who practiced close reading, for some of them, was considered to be great literature for the way in which they actually enshrined the universal values. Now, Macomb. Now, the problems with regard to close reading is that it excludes historical context and it denies the social and cultural changes, and also sometimes this leads to closing your eyes to the social function of the text. For example, when you consider certain plays of Shakespeare, when you decontextualize it and study it, sometimes you miss out on details which would actually help you to know and understand the text in a better manner. So, completely excluding the historical context of a text actually limits interpretation, as Macaulay himself kind of suggests. And even though close reading talks about being objective, inherently it is subjective, because when they work, when critics who actually practice close reading, when they work with all the critical methods, it might also be seen that they are working with concepts which are very slippery, because they actually talk about appreciation and enjoyment. By using a kind of a reading which sometimes is quite difficult to convey the meaning that was intended. Also, close reading limits the subject matter, as is very evident, and it is less creative also, because when you limit your discussion only to the words on the page, you are actually limiting the power of criticism, according to McNeill, and also you limit the reading of the text also. Now, certain texts get exciting or creative only because the critics or the readers are granted permission to push the text beyond the boundaries of the text itself. Then there is this inability of the reader to arrive at that single one meaning which close reading critics want to, because when you limit the reading and when you are actually trying to limit the text inside the page itself, you are not really able to arrive at that proper meaning of the text or proper interpretation of the text with the implicit assumption that there is a single meaning of the text. So Rather than being more inclusive, Mako says that close reading has in truth been less so at times, leaving readers unable to arrive at the prescribed single meaning of the text. Now, he sort of concludes with T.S. Eliot, who actually called close reading as the lemon squeezer school of criticism. Now, as we all know, lemon squeezer actually squeezes out everything in a lemon. So in the same manner, these critics who practice close reading, they actually squeeze out whatever that is inside the text. And this is what T.S. Eliot says, without reference to the author or to his other work. They analyze it stanza by stanza, line by line, and extract, squeeze, tease, press every drop of meaning out of it that one can. And his conclusion was that this method is, I quote him, interesting and a little confusing and a very tiring way of passing the time, unquote. And T.S. Eliot was actually somebody who did not believe that there is one meaning for a text, and that interpretation of the poem was necessarily an account of what the author was trying to do. He felt that the method of close reading was as if someone had actually taken a machine and had a machine into pieces. Somebody had dismantled a machine to pieces and had left, the person with reassembling the parts. That is what he had commented on the method of close reading. Watch out for the next video. Thank you.